Hello everyone. I don't know when this script will reach you, but I hope it does well. This video has been cooking a while because it's about something very near and dear to my heart. Bleach. Now of course Bleach is one of the big three of the early 2000s. It's one of the furthest things you can get from obscure, and there's entire channels dedicated to making great content talking about it. So what am I going to talk on? Well, I wanted to focus my attention on a very weird, forgotten, and at times dumped on part of Bleach. The Bount Arc. Now, you're probably thinking, why the Bount Arc? Well, after rewatching some of the new Thousand Year Blood War stuff, I felt like rewatching Bleach, but I've seen the main story like 10 times, so I wanted something different. So I watched the part that everyone skips, the filler, and of those, the weakest filler, the Bount Arc. Now, Bleach has a lot of filler, and a lot of it is actually really well done and well received, but the Bount Arc is not. In fact, it's widely regarded as the weakest filler arc, probably for good reasons, and there's something of an unspoken agreement to just not acknowledge it. It's something of a meme in the Bleach community, and that's about it. Now, it's probably obvious from the video title that the whole premise of the Bount Arc itself sounds like some weird bootleg fan fiction, and to an extent, it even feels like that. And there's a lot of B-movie cheese here, in terms of the editing and other production stuff. But that doesn't damn anything in my eyes, and I still will go on record as saying the Bount Arc is enjoyable. I'm not going to say it's great, but it's enjoyable enough, and I do recommend you watch it, and we're going to go over some of it right now. I just want to talk about it and explore if it, in a vacuum, is not bad. Again, I'm not going to say it's great, but I will defend it to a limited extent. I mean, it's obvious anime filler, so it's not like anything actually important to lore or character progression is going to happen here, even if Kubo does selectively cherry pick and canonize various bits of pieces. But that aside, I want to ask, does the Bount Arc deserve all of the hate it gets? I mean, it's about a bunch of Germans with weird undefined powers who obsess over Uryu and then seek to annihilate the Soul Society, which annihilated them centuries prior. So you know, it's basically the Thousand Year Blood War. That's a joke. Please watch the rest of the video. Anyways, let's get into things. Now, if you watch my videos, I'm going to assume you've at least heard of Bleach, so I'm not going to really bother any context necessary than some basic production stuff. And the only really necessary context here is that the anime was outrunning the source material and thus necessitated filler. The anime also outran that material right around Aizen's betrayal of the Soul Society and his departure from it, which is in episode 62. Episode 63 is a clip show episode, which is more classic filler of a bygone era, and then the Bount Arc itself kicks off on episode 64. This arc extends up to episode 110, which is when the main plot comes back. That means that the Bount Arc takes up about 47 episodes of Bleach's illustrious 366 episode run. But how does it stack up? Well, and I know this is controversial, it's surprisingly okay. For reasons I'm going to get into, the Bount Arc does feel a little pointless and self-contained, it is filler, but it also offers a good amount of character insight, of character moments, fights, and even a little philosophical pondering. It's not terrible, everybody, and it does fill an obvious production gap in the series. There's even an in-universe gap here, which seems natural enough. Kisuke and some others have throwaway lines about how Aizen needs time to awaken the Hogyoku, so it fits well enough into the timeline. I enjoyed it, although admittedly a lot of enjoyment comes from how bootleg it feels at times. There is some B-movie enjoyment to be had here, although that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think, though, that a lot of the negative perception for the arc stems from how weakly it starts and ends. Now, the opening and ending to any arc are really what you want to nail, because these are probably what you're going to be remembered most by. Everyone remembers the ending to something because that's what everything gets up to, and to get there you have to have a good enough opening to rope people in. So having a weak ending and a weak opening are very bad omens for the Bount Arc, even if the middle chunk is pretty decently paced and interesting. I think the weak opening and ending are why it's remembered worse than it actually is, because the opening and the ending actually do just kind of suck. The opening starts off the arc very slowly, having the setup that the mod souls exclusive to this arc are the villains. They're not, but it is obvious that they're stalling for time, and we get 5 or 6 episodes of just relatively pointless shenanigans. The ending, on the other hand, let's say the final 8 episodes, are also egregious examples of filler, but not even original filler. Where the mod soul episodes in the opening are original content, The final 8 episodes, the ending of the series, sees a lot of recycling and a lot of pointless dialogue cutaways which distract from any events happening on screen, even fights, which we'll get to more later. The final stretch, running from about episode 102 to 109, is full of flashback and pointless filler. It really does feel like they were stretching for time here, and you can tell. It really does feel like they were running out of film and they wanted to finish everything up, and yet also like they were trying to stretch runtime as much as possible at the same time. So you get a really weak ending. So the beginning and ending of this arc, which are, again, what stick to viewers the most, are its weakest parts. Which is a shame because these two plotting bookends surround a relatively decently paced and interesting story. I mean, it's acceptable, guys. But what actually happens in this story? Well, the Bount Arc is the story of the Bounts and their assault on the Soul Society, as well as some pondering on immortality. There's also probably some stuff about protecting your friends. I don't know. And I'm not really going to explain the plot of this arc beyond this because that's not really the point of this video. It's self-contained and it gets the job done. I will bring up certain points that are interesting or relevant, but that's about it. As anime filler, everything is almost entirely self-contained here as to not interfere with official lore or developments, and thus everything here exists in a kind of vacuum, and you can definitely feel that. I mean, the mod souls and I think Karia do make cameos after this arc's conclusion, but other than 20 or 30 second cameos past episode 110, everything is extremely self-contained and is acknowledged as little as possible afterwards, oddly enough mirroring its existence in the real world. To explain why this arc is surprisingly okay, I'm just going to do a little dissection of some of the arc exclusive stuff and let you come to your own conclusion about it. Now, starting with the Bounts themselves, the Bounts are basically soul vampires who can suck someone dry and then use their energy to essentially live forever. They're explained as a tribe of spiritually empowered humans, kind of like the Quincy, and derive their powers from the consuming of souls of others. Although it's later revealed that they're actually a race of mod souls created by a Soul Society lab accident 1,000 years prior. This would explain why they're incapable of breeding. Now, I mentioned the 1,000-year line because it does throw a wrench into the official timeline, but this is filler, and no one really cares about filler, especially this one, so I don't really care about timeline inconsistencies. The Bounts usually would feed on a person's soul after a person's passing, akin to a hollow. However, Karia, the big bad of the arc, decides to just cut out the middleman, go straight to the source, and suck the living. This gives the Bounts a lot more power, and he hopes to use this power to destroy the Soul Society, the group that not only accidentally created his people, but also tried to destroy them. He might also be trying to get himself killed, but we'll talk about that later. Anyways, as a faction, the Bounts they're fine. They serve well as antagonists, and they do a good job getting everything rolling. And I do like how each Bount is given a surprising amount of individuality. I mean, their motivations are not uniform, and some of them even do have relatively decent character development. I like that they feel like real people, and not just a unified and homogenous block. They're more of a band of outcasts, united by force under the strongest among them, who kind of, but not fully reins them in. In an odd way, they even mirror the Espada in this case. They feel real enough, even if some of them are just kind of comically evil. I mean, Karia himself is comically evil, but he's also a surprisingly complex character, even if an open sociopath and nihilist. Koga's tragic backstory actually got me invested in the character, and I'm glad he's the only Bount that actually lived. And then there's the traitor Maki Ichinose, who, though an NPC for the most part, does fill an interesting role in the story and does learn an important moral. It's also funny just kind of laughing at him sometimes. Another great aspect of the Bounts are their dolls, a nebulous familiar which they can summon to fight with them. One of the benefits of creating filler characters is that there's no real constraints on the nature of them or their powers, and full advantage of that is taken here to go in weird directions. Each of the dolls is unique and even sentient, and while the mechanics are woefully unexplained, who cares, it's the Bount Arc. The powers of the dolls are extremely varied and creative, whether it's the sound of water, or big fish, or big balls. Every one of the Bounts is distinct and even has its own personality, and these are all interesting pluses for the arc. They even feel like their own characters, and I do wonder if this had any part in inspiring the later Zanpakuto Rebellion arc spirits, which everyone seems to love, and some of which were even canonized. Quick note, looking at the bizarre powers of the dolls based inside of inanimate objects, I really do wonder how much, if any, of this went into inspiring the Fullbringer arc and the powers of the Fullbringers. Now, I know that the mechanics here are different, but think about it. These are two groups of people, of humans, that derive their power by manipulating inanimate objects in weird ways via some kind of spiritual maneuvering. When we look at both of them, we can see that there is a focus on inanimate objects being the source of power, and that we can also see that these powers are very disparate and very unique to the wielder. I don't know how much of the creation of the Fullbringers was inspired or shaped by the fact that the Bounts exist, probably very little, if at all, but it is something that stuck out to me, as these feel like prototype Fullbringers to some extent, if you really zoom out and think about it in an abstract sense or on an abstract level. One of the odd parallels between this and later content, which we'll touch on later. The only thing I really hold against the Bounts are their designs. They're okay. Bleach as a series is renowned for its character designs, and these of course are the genius of Mr. Kubo, the series' creator and father. However, I don't really know how involved he was with this arc. I don't think he was super involved, and if that's the case, well, it definitely shows. Where the Soul Reapers, the Arrancar, the Quincy's, and even Execution all have some kind of factional design through lines here, the Bounts don't. Karya wears a tie and looks vaguely Transylvanian vampire. Koga looks like a trucker. We got two teenagers here who love hydrating. There's a rich old dude, someone's accountant, a vaguely Asian-inspired sex pervert, and a few others. What I'm saying here is that the Bounts don't have uniformity. And while this is in line with who they are, it also makes them less memorable. And I'm probably more boring to some viewers. And for this reason, I'm going to have to subtract a few points here. This roster picture is simply never going to look as cool as this one, or even this one. I'm sorry, but that's just how it is. Another issue with this arc, and if I had to guess one of its biggest weaknesses and one of the reasons it's disrespected so much, are the 3 mod souls tacked onto the main cast. These are by far the weakest part of the arc and the most egregious examples of filler. Now, while a new self-contained enemy faction is necessary for a self-contained filler arc, these guys aren't. They don't even really do that much, and they don't really have important character moments or stuff like that. I mean, their human designs feel completely alien to the series, a lot of their dialogue is pointless fluff, and their 5-episode reign as the villains of the arc really gets it off to a slow start, tanking the opening almost to a point of no return. And I mention this because the opening, again, needs to be nailed if you want to rope viewers into your filler content. I never found these guys convincing as villains, and I never found them particularly interesting as characters. And all of this probably turned off a lot of people from the very start of the arc. Yes, the Bount Arc, a filler arc about a filler faction, starts off with a filler arc with its own filler faction that is later relegated to simply serving as talking Bount radars. I mean, they all do have unique powers which come in handy every now and again, but their presence feels almost completely superfluous, and they are the vessels for a crap ton of filler dialogue which tanks the pacing and flow of a lot of episodes. I honestly think that the pacing, tone, and dialogue of this arc would have been greatly streamlined if Kisuke just made a Bount detector app for everyone's soul phone or something. I understand that these guys and their dialogue is a way of stretching out runtime, and without them we'd probably be 7 episodes shorter, which is bad from a we need to stall for time viewpoint, but in terms of actual quality, there's no denying that these guys lower it for this arc, which could have been a lot snappier and done a much better job keeping the viewer's attention if these guys were simply here. I mean, I like Noba. Ririn is passable. I mean, some people might like the character. I personally don't care. And Kuroto is something which probably should never have been spawned. But they, as a whole, are one of the biggest points against this arc, and it's painfully obvious that they provide a great amount of bloat to it. And the mod souls and their banter also bleed into another odd aspect of this arc, which is its tone. Now, the tone of the Bount arc feels odd? I'm not talking about the, the somber moments here and there, or Ichigo moping here and there. These are all trends in the canon material too. But instead about how much of the dialogue will swerve from serious to comedic back to serious, and really interrupt the pace and flow of scenes. Take this moment where they're fighting the sound of water. The gang is running from a living puddle that has almost drowned them multiple times. They run outside to find it's raining. We feel terror as we realize they're surrounded by the enemy's strength. And then there's a random attempt at comedy when Khan tries to make a joke about Ichigo being the Rain Man, I guess, only for us to cut back to the gang getting violently drowned a minute later. Tonal flips like this happen a surprising amount, and it's very weird. It's not like a bloodied Zaraki making a quip about, "I'll have to use both hands," but instead more akin to two writers either not knowing what tone they want to establish, or intentionally going out of their way to add pointless banter to extend running time as much as possible. Kuroto is the biggest problem here, although he is by no means the only one guilty of it, as there are countless scenes in this arc, and later on, even the final fight with Karya, which are interrupted by 20 to 40 second cutaways of useless, often circular conversations. This Karya fight could have been really cool if it was just a full 5-minute unabridged thing, and this amount of pointless dialogue cutaways and even pointless flashbacks later on really tank the pacing of the series. It's not as egregious in the beginning, but as the arc progresses, we really do see that they're stretching for time, and one of the easiest and cheapest ways of doing that is just to have Kuroto say something pointless and the focus to camera on him for 40 seconds, which it's quite frankly, it's frustrating. This could have been so much snappier, but in their desire to fill, they filled the filler with filler. There's so many decent fights which are just broken up by pointless 30, 40 second cutaways or even flashbacks that are completely useless in and out of context. Towards the end of the arc, they even mastered the art of circular conversations which feel not only pointless, but self-sustaining, creating an Ouroboros of crap. I do really think that this is another really weak aspect of the Bount Arc, just the amount of pointless conversation that's had, and this is probably the weakest part of the arc as a whole. Returning to just weird though, another odd aspect about the Bount Arc's tone is how inconsistent the impact of death is here. Now, a big theme of the canon stuff is Ichigo's struggle to embrace his inner killer instinct and yet remain focused. He's constantly afraid of losing control and going too far. However, how much violence affects him here varies. While he does at times show fear of killing certain members of the cast for fear of losing control and ending a life, which is in line with the source material, he and the rest of the cast are not necessarily uniformly affected consistently. I mean, they're cool with Ganju just point blankly murdering 2 teenagers in self-defense, and Karya's death in the end doesn't really hit Ichigo as hard as you think it would, probably because Kuroto interrupted half of it. This arc does feel oddly dispassionate when it comes to this stuff. It is somewhat more passionate about other things though. The arc also has an oddly high amount of sexual tension for a Bleach production. Now, as a shonen anime, I understand that certain character designs are designed in a way to appeal to certain audiences. However, that's a surface level thing, but that doesn't necessarily bleed into the dialogue. And almost every romantic relationship in Bleach is a very conventional, rather prudent one. Orihime and Ichigo love each other, and their love is very wholesome. Same thing with Rukia and Renji. It's a very wholesome bond. There's not a lot of sexualization in actual relationship context. And this establishes Bleach as, a little prudent when it comes to that stuff, even if some of the character designs are by no means prudent. And I say this to establish the fact that the dialogue in the Bount Arc, some of it just completely disregards it. And it's kind of funny, to be honest, how weird and jarring it is. There's a good amount of possible innuendos, a few actual, intended innuendos, a straight-up pervert/sexual sadist, and Yoshino's interest in Uryu, which, while for professional reasons, does carry sexual undertones to it, which are only furthered by the fact that he seems to be interested in her too. And bringing up Uryu brings up another interesting point in favor of this arc. Since this arc takes place between him losing his powers and getting them back, he's powerless at the start, and there is an interesting attempt at writing a powerless character navigating through his new life circumstances. He becomes a sort of damsel in distress, going so far as to run away from his friends so that his very presence doesn't endanger them. And they do a lot of interesting stuff with this in the early episodes. While he does get his powers back via the Power Glove near the end of the arc, I don't think he has them for the majority of it, and it's still a neat bit of character writing as we watch Ichigo's most powerful friend grapple with his lack of powers. It's a very intimate conflict within Uryu as he copes with his feelings of inadequacy, and I do appreciate that they stuck with it for as long as they did. This wasn't like a 3-episode gimmick. No, they actually tried to explore the psychology of someone going through this kind of loss. And his actions during it even speak of his nobility, as there are occasions where he'll give himself up to save others. and he does make sacrifices to protect Yoshino, someone who, for a filler character that's not in a majority of the filler episodes, is also surprisingly relatable and developed. Quick note on her, while her relationship with Uryu is kind of weird, it also adds a sort of tragic romantic subtext to this arc, which is something I would never expect from Bleach. And it's another example of the team using filler episodes to just try new bold stuff. A lot of the stuff in the Bount Arc doesn't always land, but I appreciate the fact that they just went out and decided to do it. And Yoshino's death and its impact on Uryu are constant threads throughout the arc, even if discarded past episode 110, because again, this is filler. It's also kind of funny noting how this is kind of the torture Uryu arc, and someone really seemed to have something out for him in the production room. Talking on characters unique to this arc, I think we should also take a second to talk about Rontao. She's kind of tacked on into the last quarter of the arc, I want to say, and does a decent job both explaining the backstory of the Bounts and feeding into the tragic element of their creation, which is kind of hyped up as the arc progresses. We see her help the Soul Society stop the Bount insurrection by blocking Karya's ability to absorb Reishi and thus making him much more frail than he normally would be. Her place in the narrative isn't the strongest, but it's definitely not the weakest, and I really like how she is made to be sympathetic towards the Bounts. As their accidental creator, one could even say mother, Rontao was very sympathetic towards her creations and never wanted them to suffer the fates that they do. In fact, she rallied for the Bounts before Central 46, only for her ideals to be denied and the Bounts in turn to be seen as something to be disposed of. I really do like the fact that she thinks of them as people and not monsters or lab accidents, because it does a good job humanizing her, and it does a good job humanizing the Bounts. By this point, we've established that the Bounts are kind of victims of fate, victims of something that's completely out of their control, and stuff like this kind of reaffirms it. It makes Rontao herself something of a tragic character, as she has accidentally created this race doomed to suffering when all she wants now is for them to be accepted and live decent lives alongside their peers. I think that she's a fine addition to this filler arc, even if not the most interesting, and even if not one that does necessarily the most in or out of context. Getting to established characters as a whole, the Bount Arc is also surprisingly good. It's nice seeing the officers of the Soul Society interact and do stuff, and their actions here even establish their kind of filler roles in later filler arcs. It's nice seeing the characters interact with each other in their own natural habitat, and not just battles, although they do participate in some interesting battles. And this does fill out the world of Bleach, which I really like. The point of filler is so that we get new stuff and not just reruns, and there is a lot of nice new stuff here. While there is room for debate on how accurate the characterizations here are, there's nothing egregious. It just feels like nice filler, I guess, and it's nice seeing the professionals do their job and live their lives. Kurotsuchi is especially interesting here, as the Bount Arc's placement in the narrative means he's still using his Soul Society design, and his characterization has rougher edges than what we see later on. He's not quite as sociopathic as he is in the initial arc, but he's definitely more so than his later appearances, and he's not mellowed out yet. It's also interesting how the Bount Arc establishes what certain captains will do in later filler arc. Shunsui and Ukitake serve as detectives and investigate stuff. Hitsugaya later joins them on his own initiative as some kind of middle management type. Soifone is left out of the loop, but again is some kind of middle management type overseeing law and order. As far as filler goes, there is some legacy here because this is the kind of things that they do in later filler arcs. Unfortunately, though, the battles themselves are not as legacy defining, and something of a mixed bag. On one hand, the nature of the Bounts, their dolls, and their powers gives a lot of creativity here, as does the ability to make anyone fight anyone, as long as we can rectify it by the time the actual plot begins. There are a lot of cool fights, visuals, and ideas here, and I want to give special credit to the Zaraki vs Maki Ichinose fight, as it's genuinely great and shows that there was potential here, as while the action of the fight is a little underwhelming, we get some great Bleach dialogue as Zaraki teaches Maki the importance of fighting for your own ideals and thinking of yourself. It's amazing! You don't have to watch this arc, but please, episode 98, Zaraki versus Maki, it's peak Bleach. The best filler stuff I've seen, and it emphasizes some of the best of Bleach. This short fight in a forest, though, where Zaraki owns a guy who doesn't have any realistic chance against him, is unfortunately the high watermark, as it's very obvious that while the creative team could do a lot of creative stuff, They were also very limited by the limited reveals in the source material and the state of the source material at the time. Uryu just lost his powers. Rukia is still gaining her powers back. Chad is Chad. Renji still has the jank version of his Bankai, and Ichigo doesn't have his until near the end. I'm sure why is explained in the Bount Arc, but guys, this is the Bount Arc. I'm not going to do all that research for the Bount Arc. Anyways though, since this is filler, there are a lot of cool opportunities and it is nice seeing characters like Kira do stuff. However, it cannot be ignored that watching this after seeing the first 3 quarters of the 1,000-Year Blood War, hell, after seeing the Ukiura fight, watching this often makes it feel like everyone is just playing down the competition on a comical scale. Highlighting this is that once the Bounts actually make it to the Seirete, they get picked off pretty easily by several captains in a relatively short order. This is T-ball compared to the World Series. And yeah, there's supposed to be tension here, but everyone knows it's filler. Everyone knows the Soul Society is pretty OP, and everyone knows that none of the main cast are going to die. So for all of its spectacle and creativity, the Bount Arc does feel especially low stakes at times, especially in hindsight. But this is an issue with filler as a whole, so I don't know how much of that to hold against the Bount Arc in specific, or filler as a concept. Although since the main antagonists are essentially human here, they do feel weaker than other filler antagonists, and the arc just feels kind of bootleg if I'm being honest. Reinforcing this bootleg aspect are the reappearances of Ganju and Hanataro. Now these guys are essential for their role in the initial arc of the series, although it's obvious in hindsight that they serve their purpose by the point of Aizen's betrayal, and that they're not going to keep up with power scaling, even if they do make nice cameos in later material. I'm not complaining about this though. In fact, when I first saw them upon re-watching this Bount Arc, I felt a tinge of nostalgia in my heart. You see, as a series which ran for years, technically decades if we count the hiatus between this and 1,000-Year Blood War, Bleach itself has evolved as an art piece, both literally, I mean just compare the early art with later art, and metaphorically, just look at all the character stuff. And seeing these two, while it does make it feel like a bootleg, is also a nice reminder of a time when we didn't know all the stuff we know, when Aizen wasn't the bad guy, when Uryu was the last Quincy, and a lot of other random mechanics that we hadn't seen yet or had been cemented yet. It's a vision into a simpler time, and I really like that historical oddity and bizarre aspect of it. It lets us appreciate the simple seeds from which the massive world of Bleach spawned. It's very interesting always looking at something big when it was small. In fact, this whole construct, filler as a whole in anime, is a sort of memory of a lost time. Before everything was planned out extensively, very often an anime would outrun the source material, and that's when stuff got weird. The entire series and creative ventures went into stalling for time and balancing interesting story ideas with maintaining the status quo. You simply don't see filler on this scale anymore, and it's a fascinating remnant of the past, even if by design it's not the most interesting or impactful. If you had to watch this in real life and wade through 3 seasons of the Bounts just to get back to the main plot that everyone cares about, then yes, I can see this being incredibly frustrating and tedious on that merit. But with the main plot concluded and living in an era of streaming and such, returning to stuff like this at your leisure feels incredibly quaint, because it is easily skipped if you're not interested, but it's interesting because it's kind of designed around that, because it's designed simply to buy time for what everyone cares about. In this way, the Bount Arc, and you could argue filler in general, is sort of an unsung hero of a lot of early anime, because stuff like this kept series making new stuff and not just reliant on reruns. While it does bloat the overall episode count, it is easily skipped, and it did keep the series interesting and doing new stuff. So I do appreciate it for that reason. And when done well, filler can be quite good and stand on its own. And for the most part, the Bount Arc is decent. I mean, the ending and beginning are weak, but the middle part is surprisingly good. It invokes a bizarre mix of interest and appreciation within me, all the while acknowledging that it is ultimately a somewhat pointless story by design. Now I say somewhat pointless because while the actual plot of the Bount Arc of course has no impact on the status quo of Bleach, there is a surprising amount of surprisingly deep philosophical pondering here. And this gets us back to Maki Ichinase and the arc's commentary on the drawbacks of immortality as a whole. Now briefly going over Maki, he's one of the most interesting characters in this arc, not because he's actually interesting, but because of the weird place he fits into the narrative. He serves as a henchman to Karya, and he's a former member of Squad 11 who deserts out of disgust because Zaraki took over that squad by killing Maki's captain, and Maki can't accept this. Throughout the series, there is an interesting sub-arc here, as Maki struggles with getting over the loss of his former captain, and even trying to attack Zaraki. Zaraki, on his part, feels a little sorry for Maki, but nonetheless handles things in a much more pragmatic way, although he does respect Maki enough to give advice and explain to him what his weakness is. And that weakness is that Maki is an ivy, clinging to the strong without setting down roots of his own. Both of them recognize all of this, and both of them recognize that what Zaraki did was allowed and that he is the rightful captain of Squad 11, and yet within Maki blooms a flower of vengeance born out of a desire to avenge his lost leader. And this leads to a surprisingly impactful fight where Maki takes on Zaraki in a battle he knows he's going to lose. And it has a surprisingly deep amount of conversation, and Zaraki gives a very mature bit of life advice to Maki, telling him that he needs to learn to think and stand for himself. And all of this is great. And all of this is also hilarious, because since this was written before Turn Back the Pendulum, no one was aware that the previous captain of Squad 11 was a complete scumbag. So it's hilarious that Maki's idol is later revealed to be just this pig-headed loser. An unintentional example of the source material doing the filler dirty, but it is hilarious. As for the immortality commentary, the Bounts do a great deal of exploring this topic. Where the Shinigami can live for thousands of years, they do so in a society full of others who can do so as well, so everything's even. Same thing with the humans, who all live a relatively uniform lifespan. But the Bounts live in a land of mortals, and as such have to deal with the pains of watching everything around them fade away and die, and everything around them disappear. And it adds a tragic element to their characters, and Ichigo even speculates that perhaps Karya's true goal wasn't vengeance, but simply to end this cycle of suffering that the Bounts seem to be trapped in, persecuted for having such long lives, yet lives that are so long that they are subject to great persecution. It is speculated that Karya's just grown tired of all this, and simply wanted to end it all, which is very dark, but it does comment on the idea that immortality is something that humans shouldn't wish for. In fact, while the Bounts are proud people, many of them are pretty weary of the state that they're in, and it cannot be denied that the state is directly tied to their immortal nature. They hate watching people fall into the same mistakes, and they hate being persecuted for being different. Almost all of them are very jaded and bitter in some form from centuries of not only persecution, but also the loneliness and distance between them and normal human society. They simply can't fit into a society that ages much faster than they do, and it's a great showing of the practical issues of immortality, and that living forever, at least on Earth, simply isn't natural. However, this does tie into a much more subtle and much more appreciated element of this arc, which is the Bount Arc kind of serves as the death ride of the Bounts. Now, out of context, it makes sense that the filler villains are going to be limited to the filler arc. However, the arc kind of embraces this and even kind of elevates it to that being a certain point of the Bounts. As the arc draws to a close, Karya's motivations become a little less clear, as it seems that his goal of just getting revenge and destroying the Soul Society is more of an excuse to carry out a suicide mission. He seems to embrace a secondary goal of simply putting an end to things. He's decided that the Bounts are going to go out in a blaze of glory, and has willingly misled them into doing so. He knows that none of them are going to be able to destroy the Soul Society, even if they work together, and yet allows them to go off one by one to get picked off one by one, in the hopes that they can do as much damage as possible. Now, he does have a little monologue where he doesn't really believe in human connections or attachments, and sees them as weak pawns to be used at best, or hindrances at worst. However, while this is going on, there is a split second when I think Ichigo asks him, "What is your goal?" And Karya doesn't really respond. He just walks around the answer, because on the surface his goal is to get revenge and destroy the Soul Society. However, his actions and the fact that he seems to acknowledge the likeliness he has of success seem to paint a picture of a man willingly engaging in self-destructive behavior because he feels that he has no other recourse. And this really ties into the tragic elements that the Bounts have. Ideas that these are a people cursed by fate, which, while not prominent throughout most of the arc, does come to the forefront for about the last third to quarter of it, and it does add an emotional sentimentality to these filler characters, which, in all honesty, were not necessarily the most emotionally relatable, and even Karya is pretty one note. He's a crazed nihilist, and while the tragic nature of the Bounts does add motivation to this nihilism, it doesn't necessarily flesh out his character all that much more. However, I do appreciate that the idea of a death ride does, because it shows that this is not simply a man consumed by rage and hate, but one that has been warped by it to the point that it's made him go so far in the nihilism, he doesn't even hold his own goals, or what he thought to be his own goals, as anything worthwhile. Karya himself seems to be aware of the fact that he doesn't have a chance here, and is just giving into nihilism at this point. This also serves a practical purpose for the arc, because if this is a series of fights that at least Karya knows that the Bounts are going to lose, then it does excuse some of the poor power scaling. If we have a fight between a Bount and a captain, and all the motivations are surface level, i.e. they both think that they're going to win this fight and their only goal is to destroy each other, then you're going to get a lot of relatively one-sided and admittedly not necessarily emotionally impactful fights. They can still be great spectacles, but there's not a lot of substance there below that. However, by feeding into this idea that Karya is fully aware of the fact that the Bounts are kind of screwed, we get a deeper emotional meaning to all of these relatively one-sided fights. It's not just one person getting completely destroyed. It's a person who gets completely destroyed while Karya, at least, is fully aware of the fact that they don't stand a chance. The idea that the Bounts don't stand a chance is something that they've had to live with for the entirety of their existence. It's something that has cursed their people. And it kind of comes full circle here and adds a real tragic element to relatively one-sided fights that without it would have little or no emotional substance. Now they have at least some fleeting emotional substance. And in this way, I think the Bount arc is really kind of unique for Bleach in that it is a sort of death ride. And I know that there's other characters who do stuff like this throughout Bleach's run. I know it's kind of a trope where the villain will be defeated in spite of giving it their all, and just kind of go out in a blaze of glory. However, the Bounts kind of do this as a faction, as a whole, and it's just such a really brutal thing to see when we think about it. These are people who have been scorned by their creators, who have kind of been scorned by fate, scorned by the world they find themselves in, and ultimately scorned by themselves. It is a surprisingly dark and nihilistic series of events when we really look into it. And I know it's not very surface level, but it is something that I did notice subtly throughout the arc, and that I think really gives it a unique flavor. The only other time I think Bleach gets kind of this close to nihilism is a lot of the stuff in the Execution arc, where Ichigo has to deal with the bookmark guy gaslighting all his friends and everything, and to be honest, I don't really like that arc because it's not my cup of tea. I think it's written fine, I just don't care for it. But other than that, the sheer spectacle of the death ride is something that really sets this arc apart, and something that does lend some definition to Karya's character, and one of the Bount arc's most subtle but subtly definitive components. While I have avoided going over this arc episode by episode because that would be pointless, there are a few episode-specific quirks I wanted to touch on just a little bit. I really like how mature Zaraki is in this arc, giving Maki important life advice about putting down roots and thinking for oneself. White makes a 5-minute cameo in episode 82, and episode 83 has a strong flashback centered around Koga, good enough to get me invested in the character, to some extent, which was something I wasn't expecting. It's also interesting because it features Shinji in the title card, although he never shows up in this arc at all. The Rukia vs Orihime fight is also an interesting quirk of the series, as they actually use Orihime's power in a practical way I was hoping for. It's also surprisingly touching, as it shows Orihime's moral fiber as she takes a stand for her friend instead of just going along with everyone's idea to kill Rukia. Like, Kuroto and Shuhei show up, and all they do is tell Orihime to kill her friend. That's literally all they do, and it feels so out of place that it becomes kind of funny at a certain point. But luckily, Orihime stands up for her friends, and it is a good showing of moral fiber and practical application of her powers. Episode 86 stars Chad and Rangoku, and it's very noticeable because the episode starring Chad is also the episode where Chad got a new voice actor, Jameson Price. So you hear a lot of his Chad voice, and it does throw you off for a little bit. Something else that throws you off in episode 86 is Rangiku's chin mole, whose appearance is inconsistent throughout, I think, the anime and source manga as a whole. So when I saw it the first time here, I thought it was like dropped pixels, and it bothered me an inordinate amount. Episode 88 has some more weirdness, as Yamamoto sounds a little off, but I think Neil Kaplan just had a cold or something. It also contains a throwaway line about the Kuchiki family being the noble family in charge of the history of the Soul Society, which is something contradicted by the slightly more canon light novel Can't Fear Your Own World, written years later, where the Tsunayashiro clan is the history clan. Episode 93 proves that Fan Lady is a sick pervert, which I don't know why this is in here, but okay. And the Kariya Byakuya fight is really weird from a production standpoint, because I think they ran out of money or something, because instead of making a faster fight scene, they just made a fight and then literally sped up the music to fit with this. I can't confirm this, but it feels like it does, because it doesn't feel like it was actually supposed to be played at the speed at which it does. It feels like watching something sped up to bypass copyright filters. It's a very bootleg moment and very interesting. I think it's very fitting that in episode 98, Maki's supposed death is in black and white, since his power is the power of the gay blade. In episode 107, Nanao's voice actress gives an announcement over the Hell Butterflies, while Nanao is in the same room, not talking. Like, I think this is supposed to be a completely separate, unidentified voice giving this announcement, but the fact that the voice actress does this in the Nanao voice is super confusing. In episode 108, Kariya claims that atmospheric pressure causes lightning, but I don't think that's true. This episode also features Ichigo asking Kariya why he's doing what he's doing at least 3 times, after Kariya has explained his motivations to the audience at least 15 times. There is even a funny meta moment here, when Kariya straight up says, "Just a little while longer and this will all be over." Like he's commenting on the arc itself. And his death is literally blink and you'll miss it. I know this because I did. Finally, episode 109 is a pseudo-epilogue where everyone mulls over the cyclical nature of history for a painstaking amount of time. It feels very out of place for Bleach. It's a very weak conclusion to a surprisingly okay arc. I say surprisingly okay because I do stand by the fact that the Bount Arc is worth watching if you're a fan of Bleach and you like weird stuff like this. In fact, while it on paper has no impact or legacy, there are a few parallels I noticed between what happens here and what happened earlier and later in canon material. So I'd like to think that perhaps it has an impact inspiring some of the later stuff. I mean, I don't know or think any of the Bount Arc stuff kind of prototyped later canon ideas, but since the Bount Arc did air before some of the manga chapters were even published, there is a possibility that it did maybe inspire some later stuff, and if it did, that's impressive. Here are some of the parallels I noticed. Maki is a master of illusions, the thing Aizen is known for. There's the German connection. German is the mystical language of the Bounts. German words and imagery are also very heavily incorporated into a lot of the Thousand Year Blood War Quincy stuff. The doll of the sex pervert is a sword with a blade attached to the butt, mirroring the design of Hiranmaru, which isn't used consistently. Like, when Toshiro has that little blade dangling, you always wonder, is he going to cut himself? This is kind of nerve-wracking. But here it's used properly, and it's interesting seeing them kind of reuse that design as it was probably intended to be. Because Hiranmaru doesn't consistently have the design, and that bothers me, and it will to the end of time. Episode 85 features a guy mind-controlling Rukia. Years before the manga has a guy do the exact same thing. In episode 88, a guy uses a power based on games to attack his enemies from the shadows. Again, years before the more famous example of Shunsui doing the same thing. In episode 91, Ichigo gets stabbed by Zanpakuto, and this empowers him, mirroring both the original instance of this happening in the series and later instances happening in say, the Execution arc. In episode 82, Iba gets into a fight where he doesn't do anything or name his sword or use any powers that he supposedly has and gets steamrolled. Episode 100 establishes the ass pull that Soifone can unpoison herself with her own poison, which I bring up because I think this is used in later filler arcs. Episode 104 has a bad guy with a big axe who betrays his boss. Episode 105 has a Keto gun, something vaguely similar to Stark's design concept. Also, a quick note, real-life samurais had guns, so it's not as unnatural as it seems. These are just a few interesting parallels between the Bount Arc and more established stuff in Bleach that I noticed, and while I can't confirm if there's any actual connection here, I think it is interesting seeing how the Bount Arc could have possibly contributed to much greater things. And while this filler arc itself may not feel great, I don't mind it. I mean, I know it sounds like I've been glazing this arc, but I do truly believe that it's not the worst thing ever made, and it is often enjoyable. I mean, the ending and beginning are pretty weak. You can skip the first 5 episodes, and they should have cut out a lot of pointless dialogue in the last 7 episodes, but for the most part, it is the weakest Bleach filler arc, but it's also a solid arc. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't think it's a 10. I'd probably give it like a 7.5, but I don't hate it. It is mid, and it does have very obvious production stretching here and there, but it is something that allowed the series to air new episodes for an entire year while the more interesting stuff was cooking up. Yes, it does have several standout flaws. The tone is very weird at points, and it feels very low stakes, but it does have its own unique bootleg charm, its own unique quirks, and it does afford us a view into an industry, and a titan of that industry in a much earlier state of being. I don't hate the Bount Arc. In fact, I find it fascinating because of what it is, a filler arc that had to stall for an entire year, and somehow managed to do that relatively successfully. I know people will probably disagree with me when I say the Bount Arc is probably okay, and this video is probably going to get memed on for that reason, and that's your opinion, and that's fine. However, my opinion is that the Bount Arc is a surprisingly decent, obscure anime memory.